At 38, he walks in and everyone listens. At 23, no one noticed him. At 38, he leads the room. At 23, he was learning in silence. At 38, deals closed with a handshake. At 23, he was building connections slowly. At 38, confidence shows in every step. At 23, he was still figuring it out. At 38, he understands business deeply. At 23, he studied every day. At 38, he runs operations smoothly. At 23, he started small. At 38, people respect his name. At 23, he worked without recognition. At 38, he speaks with clarity. At 23, he learned to communicate. At 38, his environment shows success. At 23, he worked from a small setup. At 38, pressure doesn't break him. At 23, failure built him. At 38, he makes big decisions. At 23, he took small risks. At 38, money flows through his systems. At 23, he reinvested everything. At 38, he leads conversations. At 23, he listened and learned. At 38, focus defines him. At 23, he removed distractions. At 38, his presence feels powerful. At 23, he built habits quietly. At 38, he manages something big. At 23, he learned the basics. At 38, people trust his decisions. At 23, he made mistakes and learned. At 38, strategy is second nature. At 23, he planned his future. At 38, success looks effortless. At 23, effort was everything. At 38, his time is valuable. At 23, he managed it carefully. At 38, he enjoys what he built. At 23, he built it step by step. At 38, his mindset is strong. At 23, he trained it daily. At 38, he leads with confidence. At 23, he took responsibility early. At 38, his life reflects discipline. At 23, discipline was a choice. At 38, he stands as proof, because success at 38 doesn't begin at 38. It begins at 23.
If this video opened your eyes, make sure you subscribe, because what you learned today can save your future tomorrow.